Game over, man. Game over.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
So serious.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for April 29th, 2025, and I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brennan Cassidy.
Hey, thanks for joining us this week, everybody. Brendan, in the spirit of The Shrouds, which is a film about grief, and grief sometimes invokes tears, oftentimes invokes tears.
Sure.
Let's start off with a little hashtag JD tears, if I may.
How long are we going to be here for this one?
Hopefully, it's pretty brief. I think I've noted this on the main show a couple of times over the last few weeks, but for listeners that may have missed, my oldest son, is very imaginative. He has a great mind and imagination. And lately, he's been making these videos, these short films, I would call them, little videos that he throws up on YouTube for fun. And tonight he wanted to do something a little bit more expansive, and he asked me to be his cinematographer.
Did he actually use those words, cinematographer?
No, he did not use those words, but he wanted me to film it. And
because that would have been the hashtag JD Tears moment if he actually used the word cinematographer.
It would have taken me aback, and it wouldn't have invoked tears, but it would have taken me aback for sure.
Imagine if he said, "Can you play the Roger Deakins role of my game?"
Then you know I'm doing my job right.
You know you're doing your job, yeah.
But he asked me to be his cinematographer, and he had this scenario that he had created that he wanted to do, and it's based off of one of the Call of Duty games that he has. He wanted to essentially recreate it in his own style.
Okay.
And of course, he's using his Nerf guns, and he's doing it in the living room, so it's very it's very amateur hour in a lot of ways, but it's his, and he's creating the scene. He's creating the scene. So I film it, and it's a little collaborative. I help him, plot out what each shot is going to be, but he's the one that's still driving much of the creative juice, if you will.
Sure.
So we do this scene, and we have probably 20 shots, let's say. It was probably about 20 shots that we were going to edit together.
Nice.
So we do the shots, and as the little one goes to take a bath, I decide to do some editing for him, and I put it together. I added some sound effects to it. I even added a score to it.
It's going to be my first question. Did you add music?
Of course. Yep. I had to have a score, added some sound effects to it, and I put it all together for him. And the whole thing ended up being about 45 seconds. It was about a 45-second short film.
Wow. For a second, I thought you were going to say it was 45 minutes.
No, 45 seconds or so, but 45, 50 seconds.
Okay.
And I play it for him. And it's one of those moments where you wish you had a doppelganger that could simultaneously capture the moment for you, because the look on his face, the unfiltered joy.
You should have filmed it.
I should have filmed it. I don't know what I was thinking, because his excitement, his giddy, like he could not believe it. I had made his Citizen Kane.
Would he have reacted differently had he known you were filming him, though? So maybe it was better that you didn't film it.
I don't know.
So
it might have.
You have the memory of it now.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah. I was just very much there in the moment, and it's like deeply embedded in my soul. And the whole time, the whole time, I'm just thinking to myself, "Don't cry. Don't cry. Don't cry. Not yet."
And
wait till later.
How long did it take for you to fail at those words?
I held myself together until he walked away. Yeah. Until he walked away. And of course he wanted me to send it to him so he could upload it to his
By that
little
point
YouTube
you
channel.
had no witnesses. So it's like, okay, now I can let it out.
Yeah, it was so incredible. The look on his face, the joy that he had. Oh my God, it was the absolute best.
Well,
It was incredible.
those are great tears. Those are
Oh my
hashtag
gosh.
JD
Yeah, it
tears.
was the
We
best.
love those tears.
Those are the tears that I like. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sometimes you have tears that are shrouded in mystery, which then leads us to the new movie we're here
Yeah, I was gonna say
about.
there are JD tears, and then there are Cronenberg tears.
There are Cronenberg tears. Absolutely. I'm very much looking forward to getting into David Cronenberg's latest film. It is called The Shrouds. And it's a film that's been, maybe unsurprisingly, a little polarizing with the discourse on social media. But it is Cronenberg. That tends to happen with Cronenberg.
Yeah.
And I don't know if we would have it any other way. Really looking forward to diving into this one. His filmography lately has been a little bit more sporadic, but really interesting. He had Crimes of the Future a few years ago, but before that, it was almost a decade. Maps to the Stars in 2014.
Yeah. He's got some very different eras or very different avenues of movie making when you look at especially his films from the 70s into the 80s when he tapped into body horror in the most literal way.
Oh yeah.
And then I don't want to say he got a little more self-serious with movies like A History of Violence and Eastern Promises and even A Dangerous Method, but there was definitely more of a glossiness to those movies.
A little bit
When
of a
com-
shift.
Yeah, a little bit of a shift. And after this so-called break that you talked about there, it seems as though his latest films, at least with The Shrouds and Crimes of the Future, kind of have this weird synthesis of both of these avenues in a way. They kind of have the body horror aesthetic, but a little bit of the talky melancholy that permeated his more sophisticated films. It's kind of interesting to see all that coming together like that.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. And we'll certainly get into it, but there have been many reviews that have essentially called this the quintessential Cronenberg film because in a lot of ways it is
it's kind of buffet in a way.
It's a little bit of a buffet. Yeah. Yeah. It's a little bit of that Boy in the Heron with Miyazaki thing where it's everything that he's done before leading to this moment.
Yeah. That's actually a great way of putting it. I admittedly haven't really seen those comparisons specifically to something like The Boy and the Heron, Hayao Miyazaki's film, but there is a lot about The Shrouds that feels very much as if David Cronenberg made this film for David Cronenberg. It's kind of about him in some ways.
It is, which makes sense given the context of how this film came about.
Yeah.
It is deeply personal for him, and it'll make more sense as we get into it. But yeah, this is a film that is very, very personal to him. And when you see the film and everything that he's doing, it really is a Cronenberg buffet. And there's certainly a lot to talk about with it. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah.
All right. With that laid out, are you ready to dive into this one?
Well, let's try. Let's try to decipher what this movie is suggesting, what's shrouded underneath the surface.
What's shrouded underneath the surface. All right. So this film, The Shrouds, it is, of course, written and directed by David Cronenberg. It stars Vincent Cassel, which, interestingly enough, people have pointed this out as well. And it was my first thought when when the film first began. And I didn't really see any marketing for this. I had maybe seen a poster, but I don't recall seeing any trailers for this. I was just excited for it because it was Cronenberg. But there were some reviews, and I think I've even seen this on social media. The way Vincent Cassel looks here is very reminiscent of Cronenberg himself.
He's rocking the same hairstyle.
Yeah, I don't think that was an accident.
That is definitely
that
not an accident. No, and I say that confidently that it wasn't an accident. I also say that as someone that didn't really pick up on that in the moment until you just said something about it. I was like, okay, that actually makes a lot of sense. That is very much a Cronenberg avatar right there.
Yeah, absolutely. Given that this is semi-autobiographical, or at least it's inspired from his real experiences in some ways.
Yeah.
That he would just insert him almost literally into the film. I just thought that was interesting. At any rate, the film stars Vincent Cassel, Diane Kruger, Guy Pearce, Sandrine Holt, Elizabeth Saunders, and a few others that come and go throughout the film. If you're not familiar with The Shrouds, it is about a man named Karsh. He is an innovative businessman and grieving widower. He builds a device to connect the dead inside a burial shroud.
Mm-hmm.
So to, I guess, emphasize that further, I imagine most people listening to this have seen the film, but just in case, essentially, and someone pointed this out, I believe, on Facebook, which I thought was kind of funny. The gravestones that harness this technology that Karsh builds, from a distance, they almost look like TARS from Interstellar. If you just look at them kind of sitting there and they're kind of glowing. It's
If
just
TARS
funny.
was a television.
Yeah, exactly. But essentially, yeah, they're gravestones with a TV screen.
Yeah.
And you pull an app out on your phone and you can literally see your loved one inside of these shrouds. You can watch them as they lay there, decomposing.
Yeah, no, that's the key word there. It's not like you're seeing just a still image of what they looked like when they were buried. You're watching the natural process of them decomposing, decaying, and becoming one with the earth. You're seeing that process happen. And the movie is essentially about how some people choose to remain connected to those loved ones, even in death. And this is their way of doing it.
Indeed. So I guess since we've already kind of begun here, Brendan, what did you think about The Shrouds?
And we should, I guess, say up front, when we allude to David Cronenberg himself and his personal tie to this material, this was in many ways inspired by the death of his own wife, Carolyn Zeifman, I believe her name was. She passed away in 2017. I believe it was also from cancer, as this movie also talks about. I mean, the theme of cancer is very much all over Cronenberg's films already, so it's no surprise to see it here once again as a narrative device. JD, I've lost count how many films I've seen in my life that I enjoy in the moment, and then they mean less and less to me with time. The Shrouds is very much the opposite experience. It's a film I didn't particularly like watching all that much. It's an incredibly talky and droll and kind of droning movie to the point that it almost feels kind of needless. But in the hours and even days since I've seen it, it just hasn't left my mind. It has not left my mind at all. Much of it might be due to its final scene, which I'm sure we'll talk about. I know that's been maybe the most polarizing component of the film for many people. I have a lot to say about it, and it's maybe the reason why the film has stuck with me. I think it's actually one of Cronenberg's most haunting moments that I've ever seen in one of his films, for reasons I still don't really know why. I have my interpretations as to what I think this movie is getting at. I could save that for later on in the conversation and not get too ahead of myself. But I think there is definitely a purpose to everything that we're seeing here with this movie, and maybe how needless it feels in the moment, given some of the plotting of it. This is a very plotting movie. There's a lot of sociopolitical and conspiratory things that are happening, which might not mean anything at all. Maybe we could talk further about that, but it is a movie that I feel like I'm going to be thinking about this one for a while. It taps into this idea of grief in a way that I just haven't seen before, that made me start thinking about it in my own way, even if I can't directly relate to the material on screen. And I think that's kind of a powerful thing. So yeah, I definitely like this movie, even if I didn't know if I was enjoying it in the moment, but it has stuck with me.
Yeah, I really liked it a lot. I really like this film a lot. It is very Cronenberg in the sense that there is, of course, a body horror element. It gets quite bizarre at times, and honestly, no one would want it any other way. But the Shrouds is different because this is, as we've already noted, deeply personal for him, inspired by his own grief over the loss of his wife, as you mentioned, Brendan.
Yeah.
This is his cathartic way of exploring the impacts of technology in the mourning process and the complexity of human volatility that comes as a result. It's all wrapped up in this socio-political, capitalistic, and even conspiratorial mystery as Karsh's grave tech gravestones are hacked and destroyed one night, forcing him to investigate what happened, which unveils to us that his technology comes from China, but somehow the Russians might be involved. And even weirder, Icelandic protesters might have been the culprits. There is
There are
a lot here.
There's a lot of moving pieces, a lot of red herrings too.
Yeah, there's a lot here as it relates to Karsh's technology and the political ramifications that could come about if his tech is compromised. But that's not really what this film is about. That's just a vehicle that gets us from point A to point Z. Primarily, this is an examination of a man's unraveling as he not only continues to mourn, but as he discovers, or I think rediscovers, new aspects about his dead wife, which as a result leaves him in this void of uncertainty, a feeling that is simultaneously compounded by his pent-up sexual desires that have been laid dormant because of his grieving. There's a lot to Karsh that is purposefully murky. This is a very murky film, emotionally speaking. He is a man seemingly lost without his wife. Initially, it does seem as if he really loved her, but the way his mourning is disrupted by his own technology is really compelling on two fronts, because one, there's a level of ownership that he has over his wife.
Yeah,
Becca.
it's a level of control that he feels like he has.
Yes, a level of ownership over her body that is questionable. And secondly, it leads him down a path that is vaporous at best. And it leaves us with a lot of questions. Is his indignancy toward this doctor that treated Becca for cancer, I believe the doctor's name was Eckler, is his indignancy toward Eckler justified? Maybe his so-called grief is just an exploit for capitalistic gain. What's his relationship with Becca's sister, Terry? That kind of feels futile given the final scene of the film and what he chooses there. There is so much to unpack here with Karsh, and that makes it fascinating. Similarly to you, even though it sounded like I enjoyed this much more in the theater watching it unfold than you did. Yeah. But similarly, because of these questions and the layers to Karsh, I did walk away from this and sitting on it over the last few days, letting this waft over me and just really lingering on it. As a movie, I do think the film has a lot of issues narratively. Its plotting as a mystery thriller is not good. It's just straight up not good.
I have a thought about that.
But again, I think it's purposefully sloppy. Like, I don't think that was an accident necessarily. And as I unpack this further, and the more we think about Karsh and the choices that he makes, I think this is meant to be symbolic of how sleepy, or not sleepy, how sloppy the mourning process is, especially when you throw in technology.
I think you're getting into what I took away from this movie, why it's ultimately stuck with me, and why I didn't really enjoy it in the moment as much. And when I say that, I don't really mean that as a knock, because there's a lot about this movie as I sat with it that started to recontextualize, and I started to really enjoy it more. And I, like you, appreciated the sloppiness in its plotting. It's a very confusing movie, to put it bluntly. It's it's pretty hard to follow. It's pretty hard to decipher all of the different sociopolitical moving parts and where this conspiracy, if there even is one, ultimately stems from. It's maybe pulled from Russia, as you said, maybe pulled from China. There are all of these different moving parts. And I think ultimately the reason it's sloppy is because none of it matters. You used a word there in your opening thoughts about futility, how futile a lot of this is. And I think what Cronenberg might be suggesting is the way we maybe use things like technology, the way certain capitalistic entities will basically treat death and grief as an equation or a calculation, and how that in and of itself is a severe miscalculation. I think, if anything, that's maybe what the movie is kind of getting at, whether it be based on science, politics, or the conspiracy. As we said, we often fail to realize how futile it is to try to make sense of grief, how to make sense of these things. And sometimes it is ultimately a senseless experience that's only internalized in your own way. And I think that's why the film's conclusion has stuck with me, because I think it really emphasized the futility of how all of these surrounding narrative bits really are just futile. It's why the film's title is so purposeful. It has a very literal meaning as a physical shroud that's meant to basically function as this garment that wraps a dead person. That is the name of these things. But a shroud is also, in a more high level way, something that disguises, obscures something. And if anything, this is basically about people using vices like technology as a shroud for their grieving process. And I think, if anything, that's what I took away from it, why it's really stuck with me.
No, I completely agree. What you're talking about there is why this film is compelling, as it examines grief as this digital spectacle. The grave technology is symbolic of the commodification of grief. It's a blistering depiction of how technology mediates our deepest emotions and keeps us from mourning in a meaningful way. This is why Karsh's unraveling is incredibly powerful, despite how murky it is, because it poignantly demonstrates how easily intimacy is destroyed by constant surveillance and trying to maintain some sort of ownership over the relationship of the deceased. There is a power in simply grieving the lost. It's a part of the human experience. But the moment you sanitize that process with a digital currency, you derail what is most intimate about humanity, which is incredible irony given that grave tech is marketed as a way to stay connected with the dead.
That's a great point.
You know, watching their loved ones decompose in real time, as we talked about a moment ago. But instead of connection, the sacred, messy, nonlinear process of grief is turned into data, something to monitor and quantify. It literally turns the body artificial, which turns mourning into an emotionally sterile state that leaves you volatile and stuck. Karsh has these nightmare sequences throughout the film. And they almost play out like a haunted version of doom scrolling his own trauma.
That's how it's visualized. He actually is scrolling as those nightmare sequences happen.
And all of that accumulates in this really incredible way. And while I've been wrestling with that final scene, it's ultimately why I've really come around to love how this film ends, because
me too.
It's almost like a glitch in the Matrix. He has that one encounter with the Sumin character about halfway through the film, but most of the back half of the movie, he is with the Terry character. Having several sexual encounters with her, only for the film to end on a note with Sumin that makes absolutely no sense given the trajectory of the film, narratively and emotionally. And you couple that with the image that he sees on the plane in that final moment, and it's literally a glitch in the Matrix for Karsh. The process of grieving as a digital spectacle completely rewired him and removed his soul. And the filmmaking behind that, maybe not subtle. I guess you can argue how subtle or not that is.
I don't know.
Either
Doesn't
way,
need to be subtle though.
Yeah, I think it is artistically still intuitive, and I kind of love it.
It's really frightening though. Like I
It
mentioned
is.
earlier,
Yeah,
there's
it
something,
is. Yeah.
and I think that level of confusion of what's actually happening. There is a very clear moment of ambiguity in the moment because, especially given how logical everything seemed to be playing out, and this moment comes and you realize just how illogical everything really was, which adds to the futility of how technology is being used here. Everything just kind of morphs together into this one confused, grief-ridden glob by the end, which
Yeah.
is like the perfect use of body horror for David Cronenberg. That is such a David Cronenberg thing to do, to literally fuse everything together in the grossest possible way. And he
Mhm.
absolutely does that in what is a true frightening moment of confusion. I absolutely agree with you. And I like the way you talked about how people utilize these things as almost a way of getting stuck in their own grief. They find
Yeah.
this kind of obsessive uh, stopping point, this checkpoint, if you will, and they don't progress past that. There's no growth. There's no coming to terms of what happened, and that's essentially what this whole movie is shrouded in. No pun intended,
Yeah.
or I should say pun intended. I meant to do that on purpose. But it's also the way that some of these characters kind of, for lack of a better term, get off on this process. There's almost a weird fetishistic vibe in the way people dwell
Yeah.
in their technological relationship with the dead and grief. Even, Diane Kruger is playing two roles here. She's playing the sister of his wife, of his late wife,
Yeah.
and also his late wife. They're twins.
Yeah.
And and Karsh is developing a relationship with her sister. And even at one point, she admits to loving to hear his conspiracy theories because she gets
Yeah.
off on them.
Yeah.
So there is this weird sexual energy that people almost feel because of these circumstances, which add this obsessive quality to it that weirdly reminded me of something like Red Rooms from last year. And it kind of has that haunting quality to it as well. There's
Yeah.
a lot going on here that really make this movie interesting.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that's what's so fascinating about how this film not just tackles grief, but fractured identities. So much of this is about Karsh, obviously. You do make some
Mhm.
really great points, though, about Thierry and perhaps how she is coping with all of this. It's made very
Mhm.
clear early on that she thinks there is some sort of conspiracy around Becca
Yeah.
and her death as it relates to these experimental drugs or procedures that were happening to her when she was in the hospital.
Yeah.
And that ultimately tethers to Karsh and the investigation that he is doing in terms of finding out who destroyed his technology. That ultimately
Yeah.
does merge together narratively. That might be the one thing in terms of the plotting that does have cogency here. There's not much that does, but
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
does make a little bit of sense. And
It's certainly
especially
smoother by comparison to these other
yes,
things we see.
I agree. And you tether that to the relationship dynamic there and what that means for Karsh. And I do love how it plays into that fractured identity because, as you noted a moment ago, he builds this technology in response to his wife's death, but it becomes an obsession for him, and that
Yeah.
becomes pathological. It turns what should be this intimate process, the grieving process, it turns that into this thing where he has to have control. But rather than surrender to the uncertainty of loss, he feels the need to engineer it. It becomes
Mhm.
a mechanical process, and that is the tragedy of his fracturing in this film as he outsources his soul to software essentially. And I think that does play into the conspiracy because that paranoia that he experiences, we don't know if it's real or if it's just paranoia. It very much could be the
Yeah.
latter there.
And we
And
never get an answer. to that.
We never get an answer to that. And
Yeah.
that, again, I think is symbolic of the illusion of control. It's a reminder that you don't own grief, you don't own death. And that is something that is heightened further with how Becca haunts him throughout the film, physically, emotionally, spiritually. So by the end, Karsh isn't just mourning his wife. In a lot of ways, he is mourning himself. He is rotting as much as his wife is. And
Brain rot. Yeah.
it becomes, he becomes a portrait of a man who tried to digitize love, digitize grief, and ended up erasing everything human about him in the process. Which is why, to your point earlier, when you watch this in the theater, it is kind of a hard watch because you don't really love anything about this guy.
You don't, yeah. And to be fair, like even the like we talked about earlier, the way the narrative itself unfolds, it's sloppy to the point that in the moment you're gonna sit there and probably think this is just not a good movie. And I will say, for those who are maybe interested in something like this, but you're more interested in maybe the mechanics of how it gets to a certain plot point and whether the mystery is going to be solved, then you're probably not going to like this movie. In fact, I'm going to guarantee you won't like this movie because that's not what this movie is.
No, and to break that down even further, when we look at the film in terms of its mystery and investigation, we come to see that the technology is destroyed. He tries to find out what happened. And in all of this, we learn that, okay, his technology comes from China. So we know that's where the tech comes from. And there could be some sort of, even though it's not the United States, this is a film that takes place in Toronto. But there is that North American dichotomy as it relates to China. But then we find out that the Russians potentially may be involved with the Maury character and certain things he may or may not have done. And even as it relates to Maury, we don't know what's true and what isn't about him. And the film is very vague as it relates to his actions.
There's a reveal. There's a reveal about him later on that might actually mean absolutely nothing to this movie.
It
may even be a manufactured reveal for all we know.
It could be completely made up. All of it can be completely made up.
How good is Guy Pearce in this movie?
He's really fun.
He's so funny.
He's great.
It's actually a really funny movie. We didn't really talk about that.
Oh, it's very funny. Yeah, it is surprisingly wonderfully comedic.
Yeah.
But there's also the Sumin character who we mentioned earlier, and she is supposed to be the wife of this conglomerate that wants to purchase more grave technology for Budapest. Is that?
I think they talk about Budapest a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's where the technology is supposed to go. But her husband is also dying. So similarly to Karsh, there's a sexual energy that has been repressed that she is wanting to unleash, which is how that relationship starts to blossom, at least at the midway point, before she just ultimately disappears. And that, is the messiness of it. The Maury stuff, like he's in the film prominently for about 15 minutes and then disappears for a long time. Suman has she has that, she has about another 15, 20 minutes and then she disappears for a long time. Then Cherry comes into the mix and strikes up a sexual relationship with Karsh. And then that ultimately leads to nothing, narratively speaking. Like I'm just talking narratively. Like all of these things,
it's a bunch of dead ends. This movie is literally a bunch of dead ends
that lead to nothing. So like in terms of the actual dramatic mystery at the center of this film, it is very objectively terrible. Like there's no coherency to it whatsoever. But I would argue that is purposeful. I do think that is like meant to offer an ambiguity, a murkiness that mirrors that unraveling we're talking about.
I didn't think about this in the moment. This just came to my mind as we're talking about the narrative of this movie further. the movie that this actually reminds me of a lot, and I don't think they're similar tonally. I think these are two very different movies, but I think they both treat their central mysteries as very much a facade that mean nothing. This is kind of like Inherent Vice in the
Oh,
sense
yeah,
that
yeah, yeah,
yeah,
sure.
like,
Yeah,
for
that's a
you, I
good
mean,
point.
for different agendas and different tones and different messages, very
Mhm.
much different things, but the way they both use their
Yeah,
central
that's a great
mystery
point.
as a confusing facade, really to answer nothing. If you didn't like the narrative of Inherent Vice, you're not going to like the Shrouds. I'll simply say
Yeah.
that.
No, I that is a perfect comp, honestly, because Inherent Vice is a film that on its face feels fleeting and
Hmm.
it's meandering and where is this going? But I have argued forever, and so is Brendan. There is so much more going on beneath that
That is
veneer
such a
that makes the
sad
film
movie. That
it's
is such
so
a
deeply
sad
sad.
movie. Yeah.
I completely agree.
And so is
And I,
this, a very
and
sad movie.
I agree. I think this is tragic. It's absolutely tragic. As much as you watch the film, and again, on its face, the decisions that Karsh makes, you don't agree with many of them, if any of them
Mm-mm,
at
mhm.
all. But some of that is purposefully ambiguous as it relates to Becca and her relationship with the doctor. Is there any credence to that? We don't know. Like,
No, we don't know
Cronenberg
at all.
doesn't give us an answer. So his reaction, Karsh's reaction to Becca, is it justified? Maybe, maybe not. Like,
Yeah, yeah.
he builds this tech for her only to, and I guess I don't, if you haven't seen the film, spoilers, I guess, but in the end, he abandons her.
Yeah.
He abandons Becca. So where does that leave us with him in the end? And I think the whole point of it is to suggest the absurdity and the stupidity of technology and how it interferes with what is
I agree.
supposed to be one of the deepest, most intimate experiences of your life, grieving
Yeah,
over
I
someone you
agree.
loved.
I agree with that. I think
Yeah.
that is absolutely apparent, and that's what I loved about this movie. And I'm actually, as you're talking, I'm looking at David Cronenberg's directorial filmography. I think The Shrouds might be his best movie in almost 20 years.
No, I
I
agree.
I I
Yeah.
think this is my favorite film of his since at least A History of Violence.
Oh yeah. No, not even close. Not even
Yeah.
close. Yeah.
Yeah, I like this
Yeah.
quite a bit more than his last effort, Crimes of the Future, which was
Yeah.
sort of a like a metamorphosis of one of his first
Mhm.
movies, but I think they only really shared the title, but it was a very different movie nonetheless.
Yeah.
And that's a movie that was sort of promoted as a return for Cronenberg because he had been absent for quite some time. And that's a
Mhm.
movie I admired. I didn't love it, but
Mhm.
this one I'm learning to love quite a bit. And yeah, I,
Yeah.
I I
Yeah.
think it is my favorite of his since A History of Violence.
Yeah. I was somewhat torn on Crimes of the Future. I thought
Hmm.
it was quite provocative and thoughtful as an exercise in theme and metaphor, which tends to be the thing with Cronenberg. He's really great at that. I don't
Hmm.
think that film fully came together regarding character and everything else that it was trying to do. We're here, and again, I can understand why someone would look at this and go, this is objectively so ridiculously messy. And it
Hmm.
is.
Yeah.
It very much is, but, and I don't know, I'm not trying to excuse it or make it sound like a cliche, but I do think that is artistically intentional
It's deliberate. It's
to,
very much deliberate.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's very, very deliberate. And that is the difference for me. Maps to the Stars, I wasn't too high on, but I probably should give that one another
Yeah,
go.
I've
But
only seen
as
it
it stands
once.
right, yeah, I've only seen it the one time as well.
Have you
As it
seen
stands currently,
have you seen Cosmopolis, the film with Robert Pattinson?
no, that one is a blind spot. I do need to see that one. To be
I've only
fair,
seen that the one time, and that was
yeah,
an
but
interesting one. That one I actually kind of like.
okay, I do need to see that one. I have seen A Dangerous Method though, Eastern Promises, and I like Eastern Promises as well. But I think The
Mhm.
Shrouds is easily his best since A History of Violence.
Yeah, I
And
feel like
honestly,
yeah,
you could just make the argument it's one of his best, maybe
it's
period.
it's one of his best in a while for sure. Yeah, History of Violence is quite good. I feel like that was a weird trilogy there. History of Violence, Eastern
Mhm.
Promises, and A Dangerous Method, where it's like he was gonna try to make Oscar movies within his own style for a brief moment.
Sure. Yeah.
I do think A History of Violence is easily the best of those 3. I think that's the
Oh
best
yeah.
fusion of those sensibilities for sure.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, The Shrouds, yeah, looking at his entire filmography, The Shrouds is at the very least mid to upper tier, I think.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
It's very much close to the upper tier for me. Now, I understand that it's going to take some time for it to linger in the same way as Scanners or Videodrome, The Fly, Dead Ringers. Like those films carry a lot
That
of weight. There's a lot of history with them.
that 80s output is quite good.
It's so good.
Admittedly,
Yeah.
I'm not a big Scanners fan. I think that film has a lot of issues, but I love Videodrome. I love The Dead Zone. I love The
Yeah.
Fly, and I love Dead Ringers. And then his 90s films are just weird. They're just bizarre.
Just yeah. Yeah, which we'll start to get into them as we start to do these retrospectives a little
Well,
bit more.
we have one for
We have
1999 that
one.
we'll have to
Yep.
talk about. Yeah.
Yep. It's on
Existence,
my
I
list.
believe it's called. Yeah.
Yep. It's on my list to see. So looking forward to doing that as the years go. But I agree that 80s output is really great. The Shrouds is very much top of mind. Maybe there's a bias there. I don't know. But man, I think over time, like in another 20 years, it wouldn't surprise
Well,
me if the Shrouds
yeah.
is considered as good as that, that 80s output.
The more we talk about it, though, I will say it's one of his greatest conclusions to a movie.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Yeah.
And that to me is maybe the biggest disparity or the closest I came to having the experience that you did.
Mhm.
Because in the theater, I was fully with it. I was
Okay.
fully with the film, as messy and absurd as it is, up until we get to that final moment. And it just felt abrupt. Like
Yeah.
the film just ended abruptly. And it does. I mean, it still does.
Mhm.
And I was sitting there going, what on earth was that? That
Mhm.
final scene, as haunting as the imagery is, it just kind of made no sense to me, especially given that we had just spent the last 40 minutes of the movie
Yeah.
exploring the relationship between Karsh and Terry, as well as, those continued nightmares that he has about Becca.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, the Su Ming character comes back in. And not only does she come back in, but she proposes something to him as it relates to like where they're going to be buried. And then the film just ends. And you're like, what
Yeah.
on earth was that?
Yeah.
What on earth?
But
Like it made no sense
I
at
don't know, but
all.
some of that imagery, though, when they're on the plane together, that final scene, the imagery itself is certainly shocking and gross in a Cronenberg-like way, but I wouldn't say it's surprising because we saw a variation of that at least
Yeah.
earlier in the movie with a different character. But it gives off something like it just like tonally and emotionally. It just I was flooded with some type of feeling that I just couldn't describe, and I was left
Yeah.
kind of breathless by
Yeah.
it. I was left so cold, and I mean that as
Yeah.
a compliment.
Oh, I agree. I completely agree. Two other elements I want to mention real fast before we start to wind down here. As it relates to this film and its themes on technology and how that disrupts the grieving process, one of the major culprits to this film is the Honey character. And the Honey character
yeah.
is essentially it's a more advanced AI version of Siri, where there's an avatar that can jump from the phone to your car to your computer, like it's in all of your devices, similar to Siri, but there's
Sure.
an avatar that you can talk to, and it's a deeper artificial intelligence that can help you with your task and whatnot. That becomes compromised at one point. How that plays up his paranoia, I think, is fascinating. So that's another element of the technology that continues to disconnect him from, again, what is supposed to be this meaningful human experience.
Yeah.
And the other thing, I mentioned this in my opening thoughts briefly, but the Dr. Rory character, Rory Zhao,
Oh yeah, comes up a
he
few times.
has a brief role here, but essentially the information he gives to Karsh is that there are these artificial bumps on Becca's bones that, again, we don't really know. The film is very vague. Is it something that was done prior to her death, after
yeah.
her death?
Is it some
because
type
of the
of
Shrouds
growth?
technology?
Yeah.
We don't really know.
Yeah, is it like a
But-
post-cancerous thing, or is it? I don't know. I think they even talk about the idea that it is potentially like, some type of like cyber spy technology that they inserted in there
Yes,
too.
exactly. So, yeah, is it cyber surveillance?
Yeah.
Is it the Shrouds? Is it, medical science, like experimental drugs? It
Yeah.
could be all of that. We don't really know.
It's probably
but
none
again,
of that, but-
symbolically, the idea that it literally turns you artificial, I think, is clever symbolism here. So,
Oh, sure,
like
yeah.
those two elements that murky the waters further for Karsh, I thought were really great here.
I love movies that can do that, where they make the purposeless feel purposeful, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. I really like the film a lot. And in the one element of it that I had to wrestle with, I've really come around on. I think that ending is actually one of its best qualities.
That
now
makes
that
the
I've had
movie.
time to
That
wrestle with it.
really makes the movie for me.
Yeah. Oh, I completely agree. Yeah, I think it's absolutely fantastic. So yeah, I mean, Karsh is one of the worst characters we've seen all year, but by proxy of the film's themes and what it's trying to do, that makes him also one of the best characters.
I was just gonna say, yep. Sometimes very unlikable characters can be awesome characters.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is one of those you love to hate him kind of thing.
And and the more we talk about it in that way, I have more respect for this movie, given the fact that Karsh is essentially an avatar for David Cronenberg
Yeah.
himself. So
Yeah.
he's openly willing to confront his own evilness in this process too,
Yeah.
which I admire when someone has the sensitivity and the manliness to do that.
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, I'm sure much of the plotting is all a facade, just a way for him to explore his own coping process here. But yeah, I mean, in terms of the digital age, how that has affected his grieving process, and you might include film in that as well, because one of the things that Cronenberg talks about and that he's gone viral with on social media is how outspoken he's been as it relates to digital filmography or cinematography, excuse me.
Cinematography, yeah.
And he thinks that digital cinematography is great, and if used properly, you can make great films with digital cinematography. So
Yeah.
him being an artist and using digital assets to make his art, that could all be part of why he's had to wrestle with his grieving process the way he has. And
Yeah.
then how that manifests in this film, it's incredible. I agree. A lot of
Cronenberg-
kudos.
Cronenberg, good at his job.
Yeah. I loved it. Yeah, this is easily one of his best in a long, long time. And honestly, I mean, it's only April 29th as we are recording this, so there's a lot to see yet. But I mean, this is one of the best films I've seen so far this year.
Yeah, I have to think about that. At the very least, it's the film from this year that I'm going to maybe have a hard time not thinking about. I don't know if it'll end up being my favorite, but I'm going to be thinking about it for a while.
Yeah. I don't know where this will end by year's time. That's why I emphasize through the end of April.
Sure.
Because the beginning of the year, typically you are slow out of the gate. And there hasn't been a lot of films that have blown me away. You have Black Bag, you have Sinners, a few others here and there.
Hey, don't forget them Looney Tunes.
And them Looney Tunes. I love that Looney Tunes movie. But so far, there hasn't been a lot that has really grabbed you. So, again, that's why I emphasize it's April. By the end of the year, the Shrouds might get lost in everything that comes out during the fall season. I don't know.
Possibly, yeah.
But as it stands right now, yeah, it's absolutely one of the better films of the year so far.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
For my
absolutely.
money. For my money.
I agree with that. I do agree with that.
Okay. If you agree or disagree with anything we had to say here, please leave a comment below. If you're watching us on YouTube, if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, hit us up on social media. You can hit us up on Letterboxd. You can email us in sessionfilm@gmail.com. I do want to note real fast as well the performances here. Vincent Cassel is really good in this film. And
Agreed.
I think why the performance is great is he plays it very straight.
Oh, yeah.
There's a few times where he gets emotionally at the beginning of the film when he's thinking about Becca. And you can see him kind of fighting back that emotion in a few scenes, but mostly he plays Karsh straightforwardly.
Yeah.
That kind of gives credence to a lot of the choices that he makes. And it's a really, really great performance. Diane Kruger committed.
I love Diane Kruger. I've always loved her.
Here. Oh, yeah. And then, of course, we mentioned Guy Pearce. He's just off his rocker once again.
What a weird dude. Yeah, I like him a
God
lot.
love him. All right. At any rate, let us know if you agree or disagree with anything we had to say. We have another review coming out soon. We're going to talk about The Accountant 2, so you can be on the lookout for that. Episode 634. It is up. It is available. We do a summer movie preview as the summer is kicking off this weekend with Thunderbolts, which I have seen, and without giving anything away, I am dying to talk about that film with Brendan. And there's a very specific reason as to why.
I'm scared.
Very specific. And that's not to say Brendan will agree with me at all. I have no idea. He may wholly disagree with what I have to say. I don't know. But I think it's going to be fun because what I have to say about Thunderbolts, it circles back to another conversation we've had on the show. I don't want to reveal it here because I don't want to give Brennan any sort of, I don't want to give him anything more.
Oh my gosh.
But
I was already kind of looking forward to this movie, but man, that is the selling point for me now.
Yeah. When I bring it up in our review, which we'll get to next week, Brendan, you'll know what I'm talking about. Longtime listeners of the show will know what I'm talking about, but it does circle back to a conversation we had that is very memorable to me.
Okay.
At the very least. So I'm excited to have it.
All right.
So that's why I'm not going to mess up the scheduling.
I'm kind of speechless now.
I'm not going to mess up the scheduling. Brendan will be there. I will make sure of it.
JD's he's already sinned once. We're not going to sin again.
Yeah, not going to do that again. At any rate, go check out 634. We do a summer preview. We conclude the 1960s portion of our Best Picture movie series.
Indeed.
With Midnight Cowboy, and that was a really fun conversation. Do urge people to go and check that out. So that was a great series, the 60s at any rate. We'll come back to another decade at another time, but the 60s was fun. I very much enjoyed that. With all of that said, thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on the In Session Film Podcast. Cronenberg. Man, what a movie.
Bloody genius.